You haven't been playing.
Get a job.
I love the Game Boy Color. It was a handheld that introduced some firsts for Nintendo, like the colored screen and the backwards compatibility. It was a system that competed on games rather than visuals and features. It's the definitive version of a brand I grew up with in the 90s. So today I wanted to talk a bit about the Game Boy Color. We'll open it up and check out some of the insides of it as well, and I kind of wanted to talk a bit about, I guess, the argument that was taking place back in the early 2000s about whether this was a brand new generation or if it was simply a revision or a mid-generation refresh, if you will. I kind of already have my thoughts on it, but I wanted to go over, I guess, just in general, how it all kind of panned out with that, because Nintendo has given us an answer, essentially, at this point. Also, I'm going back to the Game Boy games, so let me know any that you really like, and I'm going to check them out as I kind of build up a bit of a Game Boy collection myself, and also let me know what you think about the revision or the new generation argument and where you fall on it. During the 90s, there were a lot of handhelds to pick from, with the Nintendo Game Boy being the most popular one. There were offerings from Sega, Atari, and NEC, but none seemed to catch on like the Game Boy despite being ahead from a hardware perspective. While the Game Boy used a monochrome screen that was impossible to see in the dark, the Game Gear and the Lynx used CFL bulbs to light up their screens. The big drawback, of course, being shortened battery life. It was weird that not having a backlit screen actually set the Game Boy apart. It was the system you would take with you on a long road trip if you didn't feel like packing 20 AA batteries. However, as time went on during the decade, it was becoming clear that the Game Boy was dated, and even with the Game Boy Pocket releasing to make the system more portable, the overall system needed a technical leap. So in 1998, the Game Boy Color was released, adding a colored screen that displayed over 32,000 colors, with 56 of them being able to be displayed on screen all at once. Nintendo also managed to cut down on batteries needed from the original, with 2 AA's powering the system, similar to what they were able to do with the Pocket that only needed 2 AAA batteries. The form factor was much better as well, with it being kind of an in-between from the bulky Game Boy and the small Pocket. While I do like the way the color feels in the hands, it's still a bit cramped, and I think the Game Boy Advance is still the better option for going back and playing these games. But that wasn't available at the time, so this was, in my opinion, the best way to play Game Boy games in the 90s. We also had a bunch of color combinations released, which was nothing new to the Game Boy line. I had the clear purple color back then and managed to track another one down to pick up for this video. There were a bunch of colors as well, even some special edition ones that were released, like the Pokemon edition. Speaking of Pokemon, if the Game Boy line wasn't already successful enough, the Game Boy Color actually launched less than 2 months after Red and Blue hit the US, making a copy of either Pokemon game along with the Game Boy Color the present to get for Christmas that year. I actually vividly remember the chaos in school after Christmas break when everyone came back and had Game Boys and a copy of either Pokemon game. So back then, the most popular person on the playground wasn't the best Fortnite player. It was the kid who got a link cable for Christmas. Oh yes, we had to be friends with that kid right away. Basically, when we all came back from Christmas break, everyone had Game Boys and Pokemon and everything. We had to kind of figure out who had that link cable, because we were getting our Alakazam. Along with the link cable, there are a bunch of accessories released for the Color, with my favorite one probably being the little flexible light that would let you play in the dark. It was a crude way to see what you were doing, especially since the competitors were using full-on backlit screens, but it worked well enough to let me play Pokemon after lights out and didn't drain the batteries like crazy. Now that I think back on it, Pokemon Blue and Pokemon Silver rarely left my Game Boy Color back then. It was essentially a Pokemon machine. I do remember getting a few other games like Link's Awakening and Oracle of Ages, but Pokemon Fever had me badly back then, and it's all my friends and I would talk about. Now, the Game Boy Color was backwards compatible with all original Game Boy cartridges and brought more clarity to them just from the better screen. While the Color could display a range of colors on screen, most times the older games would only use a few colors on screen in no particular order. Some games, though, had a full re-release that allowed it to take advantage of the Color's extra features, and those would usually come on a black cartridge. The most famous one was Zelda DX, which added extra color palettes and a new dungeon. We also had a ton of Game Boy Color exclusive games. These were games that would only work on the Color and not on the original system. The games were in a translucent cartridge so you could tell them apart from the regular carts, and these were also missing the little cutout at the top right that made room for the Game Boy to switch on. It was a basic way to keep these games from working out of the box with older systems, and it reminds me of Nintendo's basic region locking they did with the Super Nintendo and Nintendo 64 with just little plastic tabs in the cartridge holder slots. These color-only games took advantage of the higher clock speed and range of colors that were available. Of course, we had a Pokemon game with Pokemon Crystal, but we also had games like Super Mario Bros. Deluxe and Zelda Oracle of Ages and Seasons. I really enjoyed Oracle of Ages, but I didn't get my hands on Mario Bros. Deluxe until later. I also strangely remember playing Donkey Kong Country quite a bit on the Game Boy Color. Now that I look back on it, the game didn't look as good as I remember. Maybe it was the idea of having Donkey Kong Country on the go that made me remember this one so much. I think the reason that I really like that Donkey Kong Country game is kind of the effect that we're seeing now with the Switch, where games that were essentially console-only games, or games we didn't think could leave the house, being able to do so. I mean, back then, Donkey Kong Country on the Super Nintendo, I mean, yeah, it was years before, but it was still kind of in my mind that it was visually stunning for that hardware. And when I got Donkey Kong Country one Christmas, I think it was like 2000 or 2001, on the Game Boy Color, I still thought it was really, really cool looking. Sure, we had the Game Boy Advance coming up, and eventually we got a better Donkey Kong Country at that time on the Game Boy Advance, but I think that's why I was so drawn to that game, is because it felt like we had these console-level games on the go, something we're seeing with the Switch now. Because of these exclusive games for the Color, there was an interesting debate that started after it released. Was it a new generation handheld, or was it a revision like the Pocket? I remember this being a talking point as early as 2001 when we would argue about this on AOL message boards. The consensus for a while was that it was a new generation that was backwards compatible, but it wasn't until later that we saw Nintendo actually say it was part of the overall Game Boy line on their own website for console sales, grouping the Game Boy and Game Boy Color together under one generation. And because of this, the Game Boy ended up being one of the longest console generations at nearly 14 years, with the Color discontinued in 2003. There were some compelling arguments on the side of a new generation for the Game Boy Color, and to go over that in a bit more detail, we need to get the system apart and look at its internals. The Game Boy Color is an easy system to pull apart. The back is held together with tri-point screws, but once you get past this, you're looking straight at the motherboard. Inside, there are a few more Phillips head screws holding the board down, and the entire thing lifts out. Just make sure you disconnect that LCD cable at the top before you remove the board. Because of the ease of access and additional room that can be made inside, adding front lights to the existing LCD has become very popular, and some of the results are amazing. It really does make me wish Nintendo had gone with some sort of lit screen back then, rather than waiting until the SP to give us a system that could easily be played in the dark. For its processor, the Color used an LR35902 from Sharp. This was a custom chip that was based on the Z80 from the original Game Boy. Both were still 8-bit systems, however, the Color did have some distinct advantages. The biggest one being the amount of RAM, which went from 8 kilobytes in the original to 32 kilobytes in the Color. It also saw a bump in clock speed to 8 megahertz from 4.19 megahertz, but it still had access to that 4 megahertz frequency for backwards compatibility. These color-only games we talked about earlier would take advantage of the extra RAM and the clock speeds. An IR interface was also added to the top to be used in certain games. The only one I can remember using it for was the Pokemon trading card game, where you could face 2 of the Game Boy IR blasters at each other, and each person would get a random card. You could only do this in the game once every 24 hours, and a few cards could only be attained through this method. Yeah, it was pretty annoying. The argument around the system being a new generation, I think, comes from the idea of backwards compatibility still being such a new thing for gamers at the time. This was really Nintendo's first shot at attempting it, so we really weren't sure what to make of it. Now, of course, we come to expect it with our systems, with the 3DS, for example, playing DS games, or the DS Lite playing GBA games, and even our consoles like the Xbox One playing all the way back to the Xbox original. This started a trend for Nintendo themselves that seemed to end with the Switch, although I guess a case can be made that NES games are at least playable with their service. Physical games cannot work, however, and that is the basis, to me anyway, for consumer-friendly backwards compatibility. In my experience, I was always under the impression that the Game Boy Color was indeed a revision, one that also had the ability to play games specifically made for the system, but also were not games that were made like this big generational leap. Think of the new 3DS compared to the 3DS. I mean, the Color still uses a similar CPU and never left the 8-bit world, making the jump to the 32-bit GBA that much more impressive later on. One thing's for sure, the Game Boy Color was an awesome system. Sure, at this point I recommend the original Game Boy Advance with a modded backlit screen due to how comfortable it is, but the Color did so much for Nintendo going forward. The idea of a mid-generation refresh became the norm for Nintendo, as well as backwards compatibility, both of which were introduced here. As we go forward with Nintendo and their current projects and systems, we can all remember something we first saw in the 90s. Nintendo loves their handheld revisions, and with their current gaming landscape being so different now, it might be about time they change things up once again.